Good morning, everybody. Well, good evening or good afternoon. It depends on where you are, I guess. Welcome very much to our Customizing Your OM-1 session for World Photography Day. Um, for those of you who have a camera with you, hopefully you have your OM-1 in your hands ready to go. But hopefully we've also got some people on here that might not have got themselves an OM-1 yet, and you might want to learn a little bit more about it before you pick one up. So that's what today is all about, folks, is getting to know and absolutely finding everything that you want to see um, in regards to setting up your OM-1 and customizing it and absolutely getting the most out of it. So already seen lots of people on here already, so thank you very much for joining and being on time. As you've probably seen from the schedule, we've got a lot going on this week. We've got lots of different topics covered. And hopefully you are in a time zone that is able to be joining as many of those as possible, because our tech expert team are absolutely fantastic. And the whole point of these sessions is for everybody to get something out of it. So hopefully we can share something with you that you haven't seen before. And again, if you've got your camera in your hands, hopefully you can follow along with me today, because I wanted today to be as interactive as humanly possible. I'm actually going to spend a lot of time with my OM-1 plugged into the screen so you can actually see what I'm doing. So as I said, if you do have your camera in hands, it's a great way to follow along and see what we're doing. Oh, I just saw a quick comment on here. The audio seems okay. No, audio seems okay. Audio might be a bit funny. Bob just said that audio might be a little bit off, but somebody else said that it was okay. So hopefully everything's coming through it okay, folks. I think the only difficulty that we have with these sorts of sessions is making sure that everybody's internet, including my own, is working okay. So hopefully everything is okay. Can see lots of questions coming through here. Just a little bit of housekeeping as we go along, folks. If we do have a question that that is in relation to what we're talking about in that particular moment, then let's definitely explore that. I'll be monitoring the comments as we go along. But we've also got my colleague Brett Cook, who's also based in Melbourne, Victoria, who's on comments for us today. So he'll be able to answer some questions as we go along. But as I said, the whole point of these sessions is for everybody to get their questions answered. So fingers crossed I can do that. I really hope I can. So as I said, we're going to spend a lot of time actually looking at what the camera is doing. But I've got a quick couple of slides that I want to share with you, just so you can see what we're going to be covering today. And hopefully this falls into the category of what you folks are looking to find out as well. Lots of greetings coming in from all over the world. Lots of people from the States and Australia. Hello, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Okay, so let's get started. So a couple of points that we're going to be going into depth on here today, folks. So we're going to start off with AF options. Now, obviously, one of the most powerful things about the OM-1 is its focusing system and the things that you can do with that. But there's also a lot there. So we want to go through those step by step, showing you what those settings are, where they are, and also what they're going to be able to do for you, and also for the genre that you're going to photograph as well. Next, we're going to go into function buttons. So this is where we're going to spend quite a bit of time along with the next step, being custom modes, because this is one of the best and fastest ways to be able to get the most out of your camera and interact with it extremely quickly. So there's lots of very basic things that we can do with this, but actually once we get into our next point, being custom modes, we can actually see how we can apply those custom modes to function buttons to make sure that we're getting the most out of our camera as we go. And then finally, what we're going to finish up with is some tips and tricks. So not just things about setting up your camera, but also how to get firmware updates done, and also how you can do things on your mobile device as well now. So this is actually one of the brilliant things about the OM-1, is that you don't have to be tied to your computer. You can actually do quite a bit with the OR Share app. So we're going to be looking at some of those as well. But what I'm going to do now, folks, is I'm going to cut over to my camera. And I'm going to show you on that screen what we're actually going to be looking at. So those of you who do have camera in hand, this is where I would like you to get yourself up and ready to go. And we will slot over into here. Okay, so to begin with, we're going to start with a couple of little basic things. I've already seen some comments in there from people who've only just picked up their OM-1. So for those experienced players in the room, please give us a minute, because there are going to be people of different knowledge and experience levels with their camera. So we're going to start off with the very basic, and then we're going to really drill down into the nuts and bolts as well. So as you can see on my screen here, once I'm going to press that OK button, we're going to bring up what we call our super control panel menu. So hopefully most of you are familiar with this setup already. And as you can see, and for those of you who have actually shot with Olympus cameras previously, you'll probably notice that this has changed and been updated quite a bit. It's been streamlined, not just the front-facing menu or the super control panel menu, but also the back menu as well, where things are much clearer and much easier to access, I suppose is the easiest way to say it. But when it comes to our focusing, there's two things that we can change on this screen here. So the first one is the actual focusing type that we're going to use. Now, I'm sure that for those of you who have joined us for workshops before, you will have noticed that one of the fastest and easiest ways to make changes when you press that OK button and get into your super control panel menu is to highlight the option that you want to do. So we're going to look at our focusing types. And what we can do is roll our front control wheel, and we're going to cycle between the different options. Okay. So as you can see, I'm clicking through each of these. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with what each of these are, that's okay, because what we can do is highlight this box using our arrow keys or using our joystick on the back of the camera, and then we press OK again. Now, once we've done that, we can see each of these, and we've got a little description directly above that icon as well. So as you can see here, we've got single autofocus. So we're going to be, each time we press our shutter button or our back button, it's going to focus once each time. Then we've got continuous autofocus. So if we leave our finger half pressed or pressed down on the back button, we're going to be continuously focusing, or the camera is going to be continually focusing. Then we've got manual focus. Now, manual focus is kind of cool with this camera, and we're going to talk about this in a second with the different things that you can do with setting up for manual focus. So things like peaking, as well as a display that comes up on your screen that will be able to give you a visual guide as to whether you're focusing further away or closer. But also for those of you who have pro lenses in the room, you may have noticed that there's a focus clutch that's on the actual lens that you can pull back towards the camera, and that'll quickly go into manual focus, which is great. But for those of you who don't use that, I'm actually going to show you how to turn that off, because I know that was actually something that used to trip up a lot of people, was that if they didn't know what it was, or they hadn't experienced that before with a different lens or a different system, it meant that you would accidentally go into manual focus and not how to get yourselves out. So I'm going to show you how you can actually disable that in camera, and that actually applies to every single lens that you put in front of the camera, because it's actually programmed into the body. Next, we've got continuous autofocus with tracking, so where we can half press lock onto a subject, and then the camera's going to follow it around on our screen. Then we've also got pre-manual focus, where if you are shooting something like a static sport like baseball or cricket, where you know where the action's going to be happening, you can pre-manual focus on that distance, and then all you need to do is actually fire off your exposures as you go along. It just means that you're taking one step out of the process that might interrupt you getting the best shot. And then finally, we've got Starry Sky autofocus. So this is actually a unique thing to Olympus and OM-SYSTEM.Cameras. So this was first pioneered by the EM-1 Mark III, but it also exists in the OM-1 and also the OM-5 as well. So for you astrophotographers out there that may have traditionally used manual focusing or manual focusing with peaking, this is definitely something that we want to look at a little bit later on as we drill down. So that's your basic settings of where you can quickly change things on your camera, guys. There is also your hotkeys on the top of the camera as well, which you can enable and disable. But for those of you who are, again, very new to the camera, that's probably the fastest and easiest way to quickly change that focusing type. So we're going from a static subject to quickly changing into continuous focusing. That's the quickest way to do it. Now, what you'll also notice when I'm on this screen here is that we've actually got a display for the focusing target that we're using. Now, what I mean by that is, and I'll show you more detail on this as we actually go back to the live screen, like this one here. But if you happen to be in your super control panel menu and you want to quickly change the shape, size, and then afterwards the positioning of where your focus points are, you can actually highlight that square in the super control panel menu by pressing OK. And then you can roll that front control wheel, and it's going to cycle in between those different options. Now, realistically, the only time I can see that you would want to do that is if you just happen to be in the super control panel menu at that particular moment, because the fastest and easiest way to actually manipulate your focusing points, but also change that shape, is in this position where we're actually getting ready to shoot. And what we're going to be doing is using our joystick, so we can press our joystick and start moving that focus point around. But what we can actually do while we've got this focus point live, or when it's listed in green on the screen, is you can roll that front control wheel, and it's going to quickly cycle in between the different options that you've got in here as well. Now, you'll notice a couple of these come up with C1 and C2. That's actually customs that I've set up for different sports and different environments that I've set up. So we're going to show you how to do that in a little while as well. So just in case you're looking at that saying, hey, my camera doesn't have that yet, but that's okay. We're going to show you how to do that a little bit later. So that's moving our focus points around and also changing that grouping. So again, we're just making the focus point active by moving the joystick, and then we're rolling our front control wheel to cycle between just quickly, I'll address this comment that just came through here about the flashing -3. Is it exposure and why is it flashing? So everybody can see what's happening on my LCD screen. I've just got a lens cap on the front of my camera. So that is my exposure meter flashing at the bottom of the screen saying it's negative, or now below -3 EV, which means that there's obviously no light available. So apologies if that's distracting, folks. The reason for that is just because I've got that lens cap on the front of the camera, so you can actually see clearly all of my settings in the menu as we go along. Okay. So just one final little tip that I want to give you, and this is by default as well, folks, so it might be a little bit different if you've actually changed something on your camera. But one thing that I will point out is that if you move your focus point around, and I do this quite frequently, but I want to reset it into the center of the frame, all I've got to do is tap on the joystick once, and it's going to recenter back into the central position. So I know lots of people get tripped up by that, especially with our older cameras, that process was, you press and held the OK button and it would push it straight back into the center, but it wasn't as easy as that. I've literally just got to tap the center of the joystick and it's going to recenter that autofocus point for me. Okay, so that's the front-facing stuff, and then now we're going to drill down into the back-facing menu so we can see all the different things that we can customize in there. So I can see that Brett's answering some of the questions as we go along there, so thank you very much for that, Brett. And what I'm going to do now, folks, is this is where we get into the nitty gritty. So what I'm going to do is press the menu button on the back of the camera. Now, again, one of the brilliant things about the OM-1 menu system that's been changed is how quickly and easily you can navigate your way through this. So for those of you who are, again, a little bit less experienced with this, once we press our menu button, we can roll our front control wheel. So that's the one at the front of the camera that sits just below your shutter button. And I can roll that control wheel, and it's going to cycle between the different options at the top of the screen. So for those of you who haven't seen these before, or you're not sure what each of these are, you've got your shooting menus 1 and 2. So again, I'll go through all of these quickly in a moment, but you've got mainly your computational settings on shooting menu number 2. And then we've got autofocus. Then we've got everything dedicated to video, our playback, our settings, setup, and then also our My menu. Okay, so we're going to spend a little time on My menu a little bit later as well. But to start with, we're going to be looking at our autofocus modes. Okay, so again, if you've got camera in hand and you're looking at this at home, just jump onto your camera, press the menu button, and roll that front control wheel until we see AF at the top of the screen, like you can see on here. Okay, now what we can see here is at the very top of the screen here, we've got like what we've got on our CPU control panel menu. So again, there's really no need to make a change to this while you're in this menu, unless you just happen to be here, because it is a much faster and easier way to be able to do it by when you're actually shooting, press the OK button, go over to your focusing types, and then quickly make a change there. But one thing that I do want to spend a little bit of time on is this second point here, which is autofocus with manual focus assistance. Now, this changed a little bit in our more recent cameras, where it was actually a separate setting like what you see here, where you can enable and disable this. So if I press OK on here, and again, for those of you who are new to the camera, once we get into our menu here, we're using our keypad, so our up, down, left, and right arrows on the back of the camera that sit around the outside of the OK button. You can also use your joystick, which I'm doing there. But once we want to once we've highlighted what we want to look at, press the OK button, and we're going to go into here, and then it'll provide us with the options. Now, one little tip, and you can see this on my screen right now, is that you'll notice that on those two different options, you've got off and on. Just to the left-hand side of where it says off, you can see that little green or lighter green square or rectangle. that is indicating what we are currently using. Okay, so that means that if I change that to on, then you'll notice that when I go back into here, you'll see that on now has that little box on the left-hand side of it. So pay attention to what's happening with those throughout the camera and throughout the different settings that you're doing, because that indicator is there to show you what you're already using. So if you want to make a change, then obviously you just press OK on that option and then you change it. Now, one thing that you will notice is that when we do switch this on, our actual options for focusing change. So we do actually have that little MF logo added to each of these. So instead of just normal single autofocus, we've now got manual focus assistance on here as well. Okay, except for manual focus, obviously, because that's already manually focusing. Now, the reason why this can be really useful, and one of the things that you can use, or one of the techniques that you can use with this, is if you are shooting things or shooting subjects, a lot of the time they might have a partial obstruction. So you might have a branch or something like that sitting in front of what you're trying to photograph. What you can do is use these two systems in combination. So you can half press to start focusing, and then you can roll the manual focus ring, that smaller ring that's at the front of your lens, to finally adjust where that focus line is going to be, or where that plane of focus is actually moving to. Now, that works again really well in combination with focus peaking, which we're going to look at in a little while. But that is a brilliant way to be able to fine tune that focus to get it exactly where you want it to be, especially, again, if you've got a partial obstruction or something like that. This also works really, really nicely with macro photography. Because it means that if you start your focusing by using the autofocus, and then you can just roll that focus ring to manually focus to get it to exactly that point where it needs to be. Again, especially if it's not exactly on that position where you would want it to be, if you've got a subject that's very, very close. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Just looking at the comments here, folks. So from Edward, hi, can you show how to custom set the function lever? Any limitations? Edward, absolutely. That is one of the things that we're going to looking at. We will be looking at when we're looking at custom buttons, and the function lever actually comes into that as well. So I'll show you the different options and the way that you can set that up as well. Okay, so next on this page, we've got Starry Sky autofocus setting. Now, this is very, very simple. There is only a couple of things that you can change in here. Okay, so the first thing we've got in here is the actual priority. So you'll notice that we've got speed or accuracy. So what some of you might be wondering, okay, well, of course I want accuracy. Why would I want speed over accuracy? Think of it this way: if you're shooting on a tripod, you would select accuracy, because the process will actually take a little bit longer in order to nail that focus. Okay, so if you are shooting on a tripod, so again, if we are shooting astro, obviously we want to get that absolutely bang on, but we're also steady because we're on a tripod. So that's where you would be using the accuracy setting. Whereas you might have an opportunity to capture something when you're shooting by hand. Now, the OM-1 stabilizer, as I'm sure you've probably all experienced already, the stabilizer in camera is absolutely brilliant. So that's where we might prioritize speed. So that means that the actual process is going to happen faster, because again, we need to keep our camera steady because we're holding it by hand. Okay, so those are your two options on there. Again, most of the time we should be leaving it on accuracy, because most of the time we would be using it on a tripod. And it also means that we're going to get the best result by doing that, because that process will just take that extra little bit longer. But what you've also got on here is a couple of other options that we're going to look at. So the first one being AF operation. So by default, so again, I haven't changed this from when I first got my OM-1. The AF operation is that when you use Starry Sky autofocus, is automatically pre-programmed to our AF on button. So the one that sits on the back of the camera, just above where your joystick is. Now, I actually don't mind it being on there by default. But there are lots of people that would prefer not to have it on there because they never use back button focus. So they're trying to take an image and it's not focusing, or the process isn't starting. This is all you need to do to change it, is to highlight that option. We're going to press OK, and we're going to change it to start and stop. So we can actually stop that process by using that button, or we can just have the AF on button, and then it stops by releasing. So we actually really want to leave it on the default option, which is AF on, where it'll start the process, and then when it's finished, it'll lock. Or we can change it back to our shutter button. Okay, so quick question that just came in here from Luis. Can you show how to set up the OM-1 for asteroid showers? Yeah, actually, we can look at some astro stuff. It's actually part of my tips and tricks a little bit later on. So absolutely, yes. And thank you for the techie photographer getting on there as well. So thank you very much for answering those questions. So as I said, folks, you do have options to change in here, but a lot of the time, the camera's default settings are actually going to be the things that are going to get you the best result. So I'm going to leave that on the default option. Now, what we've also got on here is our release priority. So basically what we've got here is when we've got it switched off, the shutter cannot be released if the subject is out of focus. Now, that's good because it means that if the subject isn't in focus, there's absolutely no point in starting that exposure. However, you can turn that on so you're going to capture anything no matter what. But again, in order to guarantee the best result, we actually want to leave that off because we don't want the exposure to start, especially if it's something very long. So if we wanted to photograph something for a couple of hours or more, the last thing we want to do is to get to the end of that 2 hour period and then say, have a look at the image and go, oh my God, it hasn't been in focus the entire time. So I've just wasted 2 hours out of my life. So we definitely want to leave that off. However, you do have the option to turn it on. Okay, cool. All right. So to go back also in our menu, guys, I'm pressing the actual menu button. It does actually tell you that on the bottom of the screen there. But once we go back to this screen here, so you'll notice we're in autofocus tab 1. So there's quite a few tabs in here that we want to change. I'm not going to go into this level of detail on everything, by the way, folks, because we've only got a short space of time. But those couple of points are something that we probably don't discuss in detail, or I personally haven't discussed in detail before. And also it's something that might be completely new to people as well. Okay, so next is our option to half press to start focusing. So by default, I believe both of these are on for yes. But also what I want to quickly show you here, folks, is as I'm highlighting an option here, if I'm not sure what this is actually telling me or what this is actually going to change, all I need to do is press the info button, and this little blurb screen is going to come up on the screen. So AF by half pressing. So whether to use autofocus by half pressing in still shooting. So what we basically want to do is leave this on for both single focus and also continuous autofocus. So we want to half press to focus and start locking. That's probably less applicable for those of you who use your back button, because if you're using your back button, you're pressing and holding the entire time. But I also am going to show you how to disable the half press on the shutter button. So it'll actually make the camera completely shoot with back button focusing full time. Okay. Now, next, this is something that I only recently actually started having a little play around with, and I've actually left this onto yes, but by default, it will actually be no. What this actually does is that if you change your focusing type in your camera to manual focus, so I found that this doesn't work if you use the manual focus clutch. It is only when you change the focusing type to manual on camera. What you can actually do is get the best of both worlds. So you can actually tell the camera that you want to manually focus. So you'll be using your front manual focus ring. But what will actually happen is that you can actually still use your back button, excuse me, the AF on button on the back of the camera to autofocus. So you can still, again, start autofocusing by pressing that back button, and then you can roll that manual focus ring in order to fine tune the focus if you need to. So you actually get the best of both worlds instead of having to be in manual focus and then press OK and then change from manual focus back to autofocus. You actually get the best of both worlds. Okay. And finally, what we've got on this screen is release priority. So what we've got in here is the ability to either take our shot whether we are in focus or not. So again, to get that description, we're going to press that info button back on that option. When it's set on, the shutter can be released even when the subject is out of focus. So actually what we would prefer to do, press the release priority and go into on for both, because we actually don't want to have, what was it, on or off? Now I'm tripping myself up here. So when set to on, the shutter can be released even if the subject is out of focus. So we actually want to make sure that both of these are off, because we don't want the subject to fire. You may want to leave this on for continuous focusing, because even if it's not perfectly in focus on that particular subject, or if the camera doesn't think it is, it may still be able to get you a shot. And then that's obviously helpful if we are shooting in high burst rates. So my recommendation would be to leave it off for single focus, because again, if we're only focusing once at a time, we want to make sure that it's right. Whereas for continuous focusing, that might be something that you leave on. So that way, again, you still may get the shot. even if the camera's scan doesn't think it has actually gotten in focus. So just a quick comment on here. I just got here. I'm completely lost. Will this be replayed so I can watch it later from the beginning? Absolutely, yes, it is. So the brilliant thing about everything that we're doing for World Photography Day is all of these sessions are being recorded on YouTube, and yes, absolutely, they will be available later on. So, and also, I completely understand. There is going to be a lot of detail that I'm going to go into today, so I very much appreciate that we all might want to go back and have a little bit of a rewatch to make sure that we're getting all the detail as we go along. So, absolutely, yes, all of these are recorded. So I'm just going to press my menu button, guys, and go back to here. Now, again, I'm not going to spend lots of time on all of these, but a couple of those things, you may not have seen them before or understood what they did. Hopefully that now gives you a better idea. AF illuminator, very, very simple. That is the orange or red, depending on how your eyes pick it up, that will focus or help your camera focus when it's in low light. Now, some people prefer to turn this off because they don't like the orange beam coming out, either interrupting the subject, or potentially throwing color onto something, although the beam does disappear before you actually capture an image. So it's never going to actually be in your shot. But that is what the AF illuminator is actually doing, and you can turn that on or off based on what your preference is. Now, your AF area pointer, this is something that I do want to quickly point out, because you've got, by default, it will be on set to on-1. Now, some people will have different preferences on this. Definitely don't switch it off because then your focus point won't even flash up green when it has locked focus. Yes, you will still get the little green dot in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, and the camera will actually beep if you're not using a silent mode. But you definitely don't want to switch it off because you want to see where that focus point has flashed green so you actually know where that focus point is. But an alternative you might look at, and this really only applies to when you're using continuous focus or continuous focus with tracking, is that it'll actually flash up tiny little green squares for all the different focus points that are being used at that particular moment when you select on to. So you can see that little description that I've got on my screen there. So by default, it is set to on 1, but experiment with on 2 because especially if you do a lot of continuous focusing or continuous focusing with tracking, it does actually come up with those green squares highlighting wherever that subject is or wherever it is focusing on the screen. It is a completely personal preference. So that's just what each of those is doing. Now, face and eye detection, again, one of the things that we would generally control from our super control panel menu, but you do have the options here as well. For those of you who haven't seen this before, quick description of what each of these are. So we've got face detection only, so it's not going to focus on eye, it's just going to look for faces. Then we've got face with eye, so we are going to use eye priority. But then you've also got left eye or right eye. Now, that's the whole point of that is that you want to focus on the point that you are, or the person's eye that you want to tell the camera to focus on. Otherwise, what you're going to do if you just leave it on the normal face and eye detection, it's going to pick up the eye that is closest to the camera. So if you've got somebody in semi-profile, I just realized you can't see me, but I'm turning myself in semi-profile to my camera. When you are in semi-profile, it'll actually come up with or the square that comes up on the subject's eye will actually be the one that's closest to the camera. So if we are using eye detection, sorry, I'm just reading the comments there. So yes, it definitely will be recorded later. Yeah, if you do use face and eye detection, the recommendation would be to use the eye face with eye detection because that's going to get you the best results, and it's also going to be a lot more fluid. Now, this is actually something, this point here, face and eye detection with AF button, this is actually something that's really, really cool and something that I absolutely love on the OM-1, is that if I'm shooting people, but then I'm transitioning into a different scenario, or I actually want to focus on something that isn't that person's face that the camera is picking up in the screen, this is the setting for you. So what we've actually got here is 2 different options. So we've got that little indicator there is for our shutter button, and then the other one is for the AF on button or our back button focus button. Now, what you can see I've done here is that I've got, if I'm using face detection, if I half press my shutter release, then it's going to focus on the face that the camera detects. But if I use the back button, it's going to go to the focus point that I want it to go to. So, and I'm sure you've all been in this position before where if you're photographing people or photographing an event or something like that, where if the camera sees a face, it's going to keep going to that face. And I'll quickly show you how you can actually change one of the function buttons when we get to it, of what we can actually do to go from one face to another if there are multiple faces within the frame. But I find this particularly useful to be able to override the camera's face detection and say, no, I want to ignore the face. I actually want to go where my focus point is going to. So that's what those two different options are. So definitely have a look at that if you have experienced that before. I found that really, really useful. Next is subject detection. Again, we're going to spend a little time on that on custom buttons, so I'm not going to go through all of those right now. And then eye detection frame. We definitely want to put that, if we are photographing people very often, we want to make sure that eye detection frame, that box coming up around the person's eye, is definitely going to be there. So we want to leave that on. Now, continuous focus sensitivity. So this is actually something that I'll probably talk about in tips and tricks when we're talking about birds in flight in particular. But this is where you can actually tell the camera how quickly or loosely you want the focusing system to be. So what we've got here is high and low. Now, what these are actually indicating is how tight do we want our focus to lock onto our subject. And the example that I always use for this is, say if you're photographing a ball sport where you've got lots of people going in and or losing line of sight to the subject or wherever the ball happens to be, we probably want to go all the way down to -2 for that, because we want to lock on tight to that subject. And even if a subject comes in between the subject that we want to photograph and where the camera is, it's going to stay locked onto that. Now, this also works for not just continuous focus when we're using focus points, but also when we're using continuous focus with tracking. So please keep that in mind. And this, you can actually apply these same settings to when we're using subject detection as well. So please keep that in mind. But that's the one extreme where we want to lock tight onto that subject. Basically, what it's doing is not going to be interrupted by something where we lose line of sight to the subject, unless obviously it gets completely blocked. Then the other extreme would be where we want our focus scanner to be operating as quickly as humanly possible. So this is where we might be shooting, again, birds in flight might be something that we look at definitely with this, where we've got a really small, fast-moving subject. We want that focusing to be scanning as quickly and as often as possible. The only caveat with this, folks, is that if, say, for example, you are tracking a bird in flight, you might be down at a beach where you've got completely unobstructed background. That's going to work brilliantly. But be aware that if you get into a wooded area where you might be have a cluttered background, or your subject might be partially go behind a tree or a branch, that's where the camera might change direction and say, oh, there's something else I want to focus on, and it might change where it's actually focusing. So keep that in mind. That's what you're actually changing in this particular setup. But by default, it actually works really, really well at 0. But that's what we're talking about when we're actually changing each of those. Center priority, you'll actually notice that all of this is set on by default, but you can actually tick out of those if you really want to. But note that you definitely want to leave this on, because basically what's happening is that for any time you're using a grouping of autofocus points, the priority is actually going to be in the center, and obviously that's where we're trying to keep the subject. But what you'll actually find is that when you leave this on, it's actually feeding information in and out of that center frame. So you're actually going to focus better if you leave that on, or the focusing is going to be, focusing system is going to operate more accurately. Focus limiter, this is something for event photographers. So this is where you can actually set multiple different distances, so the camera is not going to focus within that distance. So a couple of times a year, I'll photograph motorsport. And a lot of the time you're behind barriers, you're behind obstructions that are going to be in your direct line of sight to where you want to photograph. So this is where you might go in and say, okay, if I'm right up against the fence line, I don't want to focus within 5 meters of where my camera is. I only want to focus past that. So that means that your camera's not accidentally going to be picking up any of the fence or meshing or anything that's directly in front of you. So that's what that is going to be useful for. And again, you've actually got 3 different settings for that as well. Quick question from Paul. So why is Pro Capture grayed out with my Panaleica 100 to 400 mil and 200 to 8 for sequential shooting? And why am I limited to 25 frames in SH2 when they have 240 frames per second motors in them? Fantastic question, Paul. It's not exactly what we're talking about right now, but I do want to answer this. The reason for that is actually down to the actual physical focusing systems that are internal to the lenses. Now, Pro Capture and also the highest frame rates are actually only capable on a select amount of lenses. The reason for that is that the Panleica lenses, up until this point at least, are designed to use only contrast focus only, whereas the Olympus lenses use contrast in combination with phase detection. So this is something that unfortunately is been around for quite a while and on multiple bodies, so it's not just the OM-1. And the main reason for that is that the Panleica lenses actually aren't capable of focusing as quickly as what they can when you've got them, or an Olympus lens on the Olympus body. Okay, so hopefully that answers it for you. I know it is frustrating, and again, this is not a new thing. This is actually something that's been around for quite a while. The 100 to 400 in particular has been a really popular Panleica lens, and obviously we have one of our own now, which is really exciting. But there's lots of people out there with that 100 to 400 Panleica lens, and it's a beautiful lens. It's just unfortunately that's what the limitation is. The lens just isn't actually physically capable of moving or being programmed to move the way that the body is expecting it to, because of that difference in focusing system. Okay, so let's keep moving from there. So AF scanner, again, just leave that on, that's fine. Focus adjustment, I do quickly want to touch on this as well, because we do every now and again in Australia and New Zealand get people asking us about focusing issues when they're using tele lenses in particular. So regular focal lengths aren't so bad. But the reason for this is actually the filter that you might be using. Now, this has nothing to do with the cost or the quality of your filter. It's actually down to the shape. Now, the reason why this happens is that any tiny change in read distance for the way the camera is actually focusing will actually throw your focusing off. Now, without going into a big long-winded story, I remember seeing this for the first time and I was absolutely blown away. I had a customer with a 300mm f4. Was about to go to Peru, wanted to take it on his trip, obviously, bought this fantastic, expensive filter and took the filter off, focused perfectly, put the filter on, it was slightly soft. Now, this is one of the things that you can do to change that, because obviously we do want to put filters on our lenses. We want to make sure that that front element is protected. This is actually something that you can do to change it. Now, it will take a little bit of experimenting because you will need to actually put the filter on, go through this fine tuning, and then making sure that the camera is actually nailing focus. But if you turn this on, then you can actually go through that fine tuning value into either into positives or negatives until you're absolutely getting the best result. Now, this isn't so much relevant for native lenses. This may be applicable to a third-party lens, or maybe even something if you're using with an adapter. But in real life terms, the main times that I've seen this be the most useful is, again, if you're using filters that are actually, the shape of that filter is actually throwing off your focus. Okay. So next, okay, so basic stuff for video. Again, you've got focusing speed and sensitivity, and also the focusing type that you're using, nice and easy. AF targeting mode settings. This is actually something that I do want to definitely show you, because these are the options that are going to be available to us when we do what I showed you right at the beginning of moving that focus point around with our joystick. And then rolling that front control wheel to cycle between these different options. So by default, you're going to have all points, single, cross, mid, large. And then you'll notice that I've set up a couple of custom ones on here as well. Now, all of these you can either enable or disable by pressing that OK button. But realistically, they are all quite useful for different scenarios. But if you do want to customize one, what I need you to do is go down to C1 or C2, again, if you're following along at home, press the right-hand arrow, and what we're going to do is use our front and rear control wheels to change the size and shape of this. Okay, so one thing that I've actually had success with for birds in flight is actually using this particular setup right here. That means that we're still covering the majority of our frame, but obviously we want to keep them fairly centered. But we can obviously change the positioning of that as we go along as well. So again, don't think of these as right or wrong, folks. There's no reason why you should have one to the other. It's really all about the subject that you're photographing and the way that you photograph it. Okay, so that is a cool thing to have, though, because again, you can customize multiples on there. You can actually set up 4 different ones if you really want to. But that's the method that you use to do it. But obviously, make sure that each of these boxes is ticked, because as soon as I untick that box, I go back to here, and that option now, so you'll see I've only got C1, I don't have C2 anymore. Okay, so just remember that if you do untick that box, or if one of those boxes isn't ticked, then it's not going to be available to you. But that's also great because if you have ones in there that you don't want to use and you want to quickly transition from one to the other without having to go through those steps of what you don't use, that's why you would go through and untick some of those options. Okay, orientation link is only if you transition your camera from landscape to portrait quite often. It just means that you can set it up so the camera will keep the focus point, but also keep the focusing type that you're using, depending on the angle that the camera is being used at. Set home, again, that's just centering all of the centering that focus point, like we talked about. This is interesting, or this might be interesting to you, I should say, is that what we can actually change here in our select screen settings for autofocus is with our dials, we're changing the mode like what we talked about before. But once we actually make the focus point active, we can actually use our arrow keys on the back of the camera to move this around. But you've just got to remember to move that the joystick to make this active first, and then we can start using our arrow keys. Because one thing that I did notice that changed dramatically from what we would traditionally see on Olympus cameras or previous Olympus cameras is that you can press any of your arrow keys on the back of the camera, so the ones next to your OK button, and start moving your focus point. Now, I've changed that, so I have actually got the ability to do that, but by default, that actually won't come up. So if I go back to that setting there, that'll actually be off. So now when I press those arrow keys, it's going to be, instead of the joystick, that's not going to move. Okay. So, oops, I changed the wrong one. I want to change that one to off. Okay. Good. Okay. So that's there. Loop settings is just so if you do like to have your focus point go out of the screen and then back in again, I actually don't really like that personally. But again, if you do like to use your joystick and have, well, let me switch this on so you can actually see what I mean. So if I go all the way over to there, it's actually going to come back in the other side of the screen. So that's what we mean by looping where our focus point is going to be. I personally don't like it because I much prefer to know exactly where it is instead of accidentally bumping it from one side of the screen to the other. But some of you might like to do that, and that's exactly what we're doing there. Okay. Now, manual focus assistance. These are quick and easy to have a look at. Magnifier unfortunately disables once I've got the camera plugged into a HDMI setting, but or device, I should say. But what magnifier is when you switch this on is that as soon as you start manually focusing, it'll actually magnify onto the subject that you're photographing. So some people love that because it's a quick and easy way to make sure that you're getting accurate. I personally find it throws my vision off a little bit, so I don't actually like using that personally, but again, personal preference. Then we've got focus peaking, where we can actually have a color shaded area come up on our subject where as we move our manual focus. And then finally, this is relatively new. I think this is only the second camera to have this, where the focus indicator will actually come up on your screen, where it'll be a picture of a mountain or a picture of a microscope, where it'll actually, as you roll your manual focus ring, it'll tell you which direction that you're going in. So it can speed up that manual focusing process for you as well. Also, while we're on peaking, we can actually change the color and also the intensity of that peaking or that color shaded area as well. So again, nice and easy. Preset manual focus, again, we'll actually do that by the super control panel menu. This is what I was referring to before, folks, so especially for those of you who do have pro lenses. If you do have pro lenses and that manual focus clutch pulls back when you don't want it to, or you don't want to actually use that ever, what you can actually do is go into that setting there. So again, we're in autofocus, tab number 6 for manual focus. We're going to go to manual focus clutch and then make sure that we turn that off. So that way, even now, if I go to my lens, I can go backwards and forwards, and it's not going to be enabled. Okay, perfecto. Okay, so let me just quickly change something because I want that to be off for later. Perfect. Okay. Manual. You can change the way that the manual focus ring goes, but we don't really need to look at that. Reset lens. This is actually something that I do want to talk about because I've spoken to quite a few wildlife photographers and videographers about this. This is a setting in camera, so your camera will actually need to have this. It is about the camera, not the lens. What that reset lens is all about is that if you, for example, are sitting in a hide or sitting somewhere where you're waiting for something to happen. If you turn the camera off, if you leave reset lens off, it'll, when you turn it back on again, it'll be the focusing point will be left where it was. Whereas if you turn that on, it's going to reset to a default position. So again, really only applicable to people that sit in hides or sitting for long periods of time where they might want to have the camera switched off, so you're not wasting battery. That's what that setting on is all about. Okay, so I can see a couple of things that have come up through, just going through the questions now, folks. So so if you shoot birds that have busy backgrounds, which is the best combination for long lenses? So that's from Dow's Photography. We'll actually talk about this in more detail when I actually go through setting up a custom profile, if that's okay. But what I will mention is that what I found, especially with the OM-1, because it's our second camera that has subject detection, what I've actually found with the OM-1 is that when you're using subject detection, I actually find that even if you do make a change to the sensitivity, it might go faster, but it still actually locks onto the subject really, really well, as opposed to if you were just using your normal continuous focus with tracking. But what I'll actually take you through the way that I would set a camera up for birds in flight. One of the most challenging things that that you can photograph. So that's definitely what we're going to talk about in a little while. So if that's okay, I'll move on just because I've just realized the time and we want to make sure that we cover everything that we need to. But setting up that custom profile, I'm going to show you one of those things that we would do for birds in flight. Okay. All right. Next, what we're going to quickly do is go into our button settings. Now, somebody has already asked about button and dial and also lever. What we've got here on our super control panel menu is only for buttons. Okay, so this is where I'm going to start, but I will go into where we're setting up buttons in a little while. So once we go in our super control panel menu, we press the OK button on our little picture of the cog or the gear here. This is where we're going to go into changing our function buttons. Now, again, something that we've had for a couple of generations of camera now is that it actually shows you where this function button is positioned on the camera as we go through the different options here, which is awesome because on older cameras it didn't have that. But also next to it, it also has a little icon showing you what each of these function buttons is already pre-programmed to. Okay, so I'm going to go through the different options on here because this is the way that I would set my camera up and have this by default. But again, that's the way I have mine set up. That is not any right or wrong. It's a purely personal thing. But one of, if for the folks that do a lot of subject recognition focusing, so whether it be the pets or birds in particular, one thing that I found really, really useful for setting up a function button for is actually to have that subject detection at one touch. Now, I don't use my my plus minus button or my exposure compensation button. So that's what I've actually got that pre-programmed to. And the reason why this is so cool to have this at one touch is that if I'm sitting there ready to shoot, all I've got to do is tap that button and you'll notice that that little bird indicator comes up at the top of my screen. Okay, so really fast, really easy. But if I want to quickly change that from one subject to another, all I've got to do is press that same button and hold it, so that plus minus button on the top of the camera, and then roll that rear control wheel where my thumb sits, and now I can quickly change from one to the other. So what the engineers did actually think about quite a lot, which was brilliant, is that they put birds and wildlife next to each other. It just means that if you are out and about and those are the two things that you want to photograph, that you don't have to go from one end of the menu system to the other. So that's really cool. So again, you can see on my birds, press and hold, roll that rear dial over to pets or wildlife. You'll see that indicator changes at the top of my screen. But once I've finished photographing the subject, all I've got to do is tap that button again, and it's going to switch itself off. Okay, so really fast, really easy way of having your camera set up that way full time. So again, not even part of a custom profile, which we'll look at in a second. But you've got lots of different things you can change in each of these options. So I'll go through them all one at a time just so you can see them. But this is, I'm not going to go through and change and customize every single button. I just want to show you what the different options are. So once I press OK on this subject here, you'll go through all the different tabs of all the different things that you can change. Now, what I love about this new setup in the way that they've done this is that it actually gives you a full description of what each of these subjects is going to do for you. Okay, so you've got press to switch, so you've got subject detection on and off. So that's what that little 3D box is indicating. Then we've got switching face detection on and off, selecting a face. So if you do photograph with face detection, when I set up my portrait custom mode, I'll show you how to do that in a little while, but that's an option there. Actually, I'm not going to go through all of these individually because it's going to take too long. But as you can see, there's so many different things that you can do to, or that you can set up on each of these individual buttons. But those couple of things, so subject detection, live neutral density filter, face selection, also bracketing and that sort of thing as well is absolutely awesome. But the other thing that we're going to find really useful once we actually start setting up our custom profiles is actually applying that custom profile to a function button that we can press it once to activate it and then press it once more to switch it off. So instead of having to stop what you're doing and roll the mode dial on top of your camera, we don't actually have to do that. All we've got to do is apply it to a function button. And then probably the hardest part of using custom modes is actually remembering what C1, C2, C3, and C4 is. So one of the things that I've actually requested is to be able to rename what those custom profiles are. So that way we can actually quickly go into the camera and go, okay, cool. So that's my birds in flight. That's my astro one. That's my macro one, etc., etc. Okay. So that's a quick and easy way to get into our button functions. So we can go in there and change all of those different buttons that are positioned all over the camera. I've also got a battery grip on here, so you'll notice that these are active and live as well. And also, if you have a pro lens, you've also got another one on there, which is for AF stop, or pre-programmed to AF stop, I should say. Okay. So that is how you access or quickly and easily access your function buttons. But what we're actually going to do is go across to our picture of our little cog at the top of the screen here. And what this is under tab number 1, you'll see that it's under operations. Now, what we've got here is our button settings, which is exactly like what we saw in here, but you can actually change them for when you're shooting video or when you're shooting stills. But again, what we actually see on our screen is identical. We've got our dial settings as well, so you can actually go through and change what our function or dials are going to do. This is particularly useful if you're coming from a different system. And what I mean by that is that if you've shot with another system where you're predominantly shooting manual, but your shutter speed is on your front control wheel and then your aperture is on your rear wheel, you can actually go into here and change those around. Okay, so really quick and really easy to do. You can really make that camera your own and make it more comfortable, especially if your muscle memory is telling you to shoot with a previous camera the way that you might need to. You multi-select the settings. So again, that's just what we're doing to change our joystick and what that's doing for us. But function lever, this is definitely where we want to spend a little bit of time when we're customizing our camera and the way that the camera's behaving with that function lever. Now, some of you might not know what we're talking about and saying, what is a function lever and where is it on the camera? If you look at the back of your camera, just to the right-hand side of your viewfinder, you've got a little button there that says AEL, and then on the outside of that, you've got a little switch with a number 1 and a number 2. That's what we're talking about with our function lever. Okay, so when I press OK on our function lever settings, you can see the different things that we've got on here as well. So I'm in a still shooting setting, so that's why function lever is switched off. But what I can do is press OK on our function lever function, and now we've got 4 different modes that we can select. So if you never use this and you don't want to use this, you don't want to bump it and have something change, then you're going to switch that off. Whereas if you go into mode number 1, it's going to change our dial function. So let's have a quick look at that when we go into mode 1. So I'm on number 1 here right now, where my front control wheel is controlling our aperture and the rear one is controlling our shutter speed. If I flick that function lever now, what we've got here is white balance and ISO control on here as well. Okay, so again, we can actually go in and change what those are going to do for us. Probably less important on an OM-1 now because we've had this sort of set up previously, but it's probably less important on an OM-1 mainly because we've got a dedicated ISO button. And for those of you who want to change white balance on the fly, again, it's a one press, either controlled by a function button as opposed to changing the switch. But that's mode 1. Then we can go into mode 2. Now, I find this particularly useful, especially if I'm photographing sports or wildlife, because when we select mode number 2, what we can actually do is I'm in mode 1, and right now you can see that I'm in regular continuous focus and I've got my mid focus point set up. So it's not the largest, but it's not the smallest. What I can actually do now is flick that little switch on the back of the camera, and you'll notice that my focus point has changed back to a small one. But also notice that my focusing type has changed to manual. Okay, so the reason why this is really cool is that I can say change this to continuous focus with tracking, and I can change my focus points to all. That way, all I've got to do with the flick of that little switch at the back is be normally continuously focusing using putting my subject in that box, flick of that switch, and now I'm using all my focus points with tracking. So that again works particularly well when we use it in combination with our subject recognition focus. So birds in particular is a great way to be able to do that. All I've got to do is press my plus minus button on the top of the camera that I had set up for subject recognition, and then flick my switch, and now I've got subject recognition being used in combination with continuous focus with tracking, and it's using all the focus points. So as soon as it recognizes that subject, bang, it's going to lock onto to the subject for me as soon as I start pressing a button. Okay, so that's the second option, or option 2, with our function lever settings. Next, and finally, we've also got mode number 3. Now, in mode number 3, this can also be useful, and I found this if I've shot events, this can be particularly useful as well, because instead of having to stop what I'm doing and look at the top of my camera, roll my mode dial around into video, what I can do is set up that function lever to quickly transition in between shooting in stills and in shooting in video. So right now in my stills mode, doing my thing, and then I flick that switch and bang, I go straight into video. Okay. So really quick, really easy. And what is brilliant about the setup with the OM-1 as well is that the things that you change and the way that you set the camera up in video is independent of what you're doing in stills. So I can change that. Well, let's go in the opposite direction. Let's change that to 6.3. And then I'll pop that switch back to position number 1. You can see that my aperture drops back down to f2.8. Okay, so everything saves independently. So if you do actually use your camera to in combination between stills and video, that actual setting can actually be really useful to you by going into mode number 3. So that little lever at the back is going to let you quickly flick in between shooting in stills and video. Okay. Now, finally, what you've got on here is your function power lever. So right now we've got it set to function. So again, changing the function of what that's going to do, or what the camera is going to do. But what we can also do, and this is actually something that I know lots of people like to do, is so they have everything at one touch. What they do is actually change that function lever 1 and 2 to power the camera off and on. Okay. So what we or off and on. So you've actually got on or off, and then off and on, depending on what the position of the switch is. Now, I personally like to leave it on function because, again, I think I can get the most out of it by controlling a function by there. But for those of you who do want to actually power the camera on and off by using that switch, that's where you're going to go to. Okay. So just a couple of questions that I want to read through here, folks. So from Laura. Please go over how to change the custom mode settings. Once set, how do I change them to something else? Absolutely, Laura, we're going to do that right now. And from Jeff, how do I remove the red cross lines on the screen when focusing? That, Jeff, that may be because you've changed the grid color, which I can take you through it in a little while. It wasn't actually part of what I was going to cover today, but that is actually something. Actually, you know what? Let's quickly do it now. Because we are going to get into setting custom profiles straight after this. Okay, so what I'm going to quickly do is go to grid settings. Now, if yours are coming up in red, the only thing that I can assume, Jeff, is that you've actually changed the display color while you're in your grid settings. Okay, so if we've got preset 1 and preset 2, what I can actually do is go in here and change these to complete red. So you'll actually see a red square come up on my screen here, and also the actual grid lines that I've selected there are coming up in red as well. If that's the red that you're talking about, Jeff, that's really the only thing that I can think of where you would actually be changing the color of that, or what would be coming up in red, or why that would be coming up in red. Okay, so hopefully that answers that question for you really quickly, but if it doesn't, please let me know. Also, another comment in here. So I'm so sorry, Valerie, that I am going to quickly. I just don't want to miss anything out. But as we talked about before, there is all of this is going to be recorded, folks, so we can go back over and watch it again. There's also always lots of new sessions coming up from us as well. So lots of people jumped onto this to this session and lots of the sessions that we've done so far. So this is definitely something that I would be looking to potentially redo in the future as well, because the response to it has been really, really good. And also that means that everybody's got an opportunity to jump on and do this again and hopefully come back armed with some more questions if we need to. So Valerie, I hear you, and I apologize if I am going a little bit quicker than what I need to, but I sort of get excited and then go, oh, okay, I've got to move on to the next thing. So apologies for that. Question from Brandon. So renaming C1, C3, C2, C3, C4. Fantastic suggestion. Looking forward to implementing in firmware 1.6. Yeah, Brandon, I've been talking about this for a while, pretty much since we had custom modes set into, I think it was the OM-1 Mark II. So really crossing our fingers we do get that, because I know it'll make a massive difference to my life, and I know it'll make a massive difference to everybody else's life as well. Okay. So next point that we're going to move on to, folks, is our setting up our custom profiles. Now, again, this is an absolutely brilliant way to be able to interact with your camera, to be able to set the camera up really quickly from one mode to another. And we're actually going to do a couple of these so you can actually follow along, and maybe even the way that I'm going to do this is going to be applicable to the way that you photograph. Quick note from Russell: don't want to make enemies. Just got my 150 to 400 mil this week. Yes, you very lucky thing. I have a very pre-production sample of one, and I actually shot some of my colleague Brett's football over the weekend. I hadn't shot with it for a while, and it is just a joy to use. So well done you, because you will definitely love that. Smash the thumb button. Only 22 out of 108 watching. Brandon, yeah, thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. What we also do quickly find, I'll quickly cover this. What we do actually find is that when we do these on YouTube, a lot of people will sign up and register, but then watch it later. And we very much appreciate that. People are going to be working, or it's going to be overnight, depending on time and that sort of thing. So anyway, I digress. So what we need to remember, guys, if when we're setting up a custom profile, is that you have to start at the absolute beginning. So everything that you would want to do or have your camera do in its regular shooting mode when you're not shooting in a custom profile, we absolutely want to make sure that we've got all of those things set as a baseline. Okay. So what I'm going to quickly do as well, because I wanted to talk about this right at the beginning, but I forgot, is one of the things that I know that has tripped up a lot of people with our older cameras as well as with the OM-1 is in regards to file naming. Now, this is something that, again, we absolutely want to change as soon as we pick up our camera or as soon as we start setting up our camera. And what we're doing here, guys, is going to the spanner option at the top of the menu. So menu button and then spanner. And then in this tab number 1, what I want you to do is go down to where it says file name. Now, this will actually be preset to reset. And we definitely don't want to have it set on reset, because if you take as many photographs as me, and I'm sure lots of you do, maybe even more, we don't want our file numbering to be reset every single time we take a card out and reformat that card. Obviously, it creates massive problems with, well, not massive problems, but it can create problems with importing. And also depending on how you catalog your images and where you import them to. If you've got duplicate file names or numbers, we definitely want to avoid that. So first step before when you get your camera is go to the spanner, go to tab number 1 and down to file name. And we want to change that to auto instead of reset. Okay, really important. So all of the other things that we would do. So let me give you a quick rundown of some of the things that I do when I first get a camera. So first thing that I do, and I don't even know why that's in 16:9, but that's okay. Oh, that's right. I was shooting something else differently yesterday. So what we're actually going to do, that's why I changed it, because we're looking at 16:9 in what you guys are seeing. So that's why I changed it. The first thing that I would do is go into each of these steps, and I'm going to turn my white balance, keeping the color warm off. I'm going to change my default ISO limit down to 20 just to make sure that it's absolutely within its premium working distance. 25,600 actually still works really, really nicely, but you've got to make sure you nail your exposure. And if you use auto ISO a lot of the time, that might be something that you look at. Noise filter, I select low instead of standard because I want as much detail in those original images as I can. Low ISO processing, again, we want to prioritize the detail as opposed to the drive. That is something that you will need to change because by default it will be on drive priority. Again, all of these things aren't overly important, folks. The point really what I'm making is that before you start building custom profiles, if you want all of the things that you want to be applied in your everyday shooting to also be applied in your custom modes, make sure you go through all of these and make sure that you set them the way that you want before you even start building your custom profile. Okay, so all of those different things, that's pretty much the staples of what we would do to make sure that everything's right. And now we've done all of those and we're going to start building a custom profile. So the first one that I'm going to do is for portraiture or shooting or photographing people. Now, the starting point for this is your mode dial. So what we're going to do is select our mode dial on the top of the camera, and I'm going to change that to aperture priority. Now, brilliant part about shooting with aperture priority is that all I've got to do is change the aperture, and then the camera is going to change all of the other settings for me in order to get the exposure where the camera thinks it should be based on its metering. But the reason why we want to use it, aperture priority for shooting or photographing people is that we predominantly want to make sure that we're getting as much in focus as what we need, or making sure at the very least we're getting the subject's face in focus. So that's where you would, again, use aperture priority as a starting point. But the next thing that we will want to do is press our OK button on the back of the camera, and then we want to, well, I'm going to use continuous focus because, again, we might be photographing people as they're moving around. So we want to use continuous focus, but we want to use it in combination with face and eye detection. Okay, now I'm going to change that to 4:3 because I don't want my files to come out in 16:9. Quick note on that, actually, that I haven't mentioned before, is that on this screen here, you've got your different aspect ratios. Remembering that if you shoot in JPEG, whatever you select here, that is the way that that photograph is going to be ratioed or framed. However, if you do shoot something in RAW, or exclusively in RAW, but you change the ratio, let me show you what happens. So I'm going to put this onto 16:9. I'm just going to take a shot. Oh, that's going to take forever now. I just realized that I didn't set my ISO. No, my ISO was at 200. Anyway, I'll let that do its thing as it goes along, because it's probably going to take a minute long exposure now because I wasn't paying attention to my shutter speed. But what we want to do with the face and eye detection, so again, we want to make sure that we're actually using our, let me get out of that. I don't want to switch it off. So that's okay. I'm just going to let that do its thing. So yeah, so thinking about face and eye detection, so we want to make sure that if we are doing face and eye detection, sorry folks, because if I turn my camera off, I don't want it to lose the feed into what you guys are showing. So I'm just going to let it do its thing. So face and actually, you know what? That's taking too long. I'm just going to turn that off. Actually, yeah, there we go. Hopefully that comes back on. Yep, there we go. Okay, so I'm not going to do that again because there you go. It was going to take a 60-second exposure. So face and eye detection, again, knowing that face and eye is going to pick out the eye that we want to photograph. But what we also want to do with our aspect ratio, that's what we were talking about, is that when we photograph a raw image, or if we're only shooting in RAW, what's actually going to happen is that you're still going to have the raw file in the 4:3, which is native to the sensor. All you're going to see is a little white box come up on the screen when you review the image, and that is whatever that aspect ratio is that you've set. Okay, so again, no right or wrong with that. I know that when I'm shooting for presentations and that sort of thing, I'll actually default or change that to 16:9. Because it means that the way that I've actually captured that image when I'm putting it into a PowerPoint slide or something like that, the ratio is going to fit instead of having to take it in 4:3 and then either crop it in or zoom it out or reshape it basically to fit into a 16:9 slide. So please keep that in mind as you're doing it. Drive mode, obviously you've got lots of different options in here. We'll look at these in more detail when we start shooting and thinking about high-speed shooting. But what I would probably use for an event would be the silent sequential. And the reason for that is that we don't want our camera beeping and clicking at people as we go along. It means that we can be properly discreet without disturbing people. And also when you're trying to capture those beautiful candid images of where people are just behaving the way that they're behaving at whatever they happen to be doing. So I think, weddings and that sort of thing where you want to capture people having those beautiful fun moments without being that person that everybody's paying attention to because you've got a camera in your hand. So that's a great thing to do as well. But that also gives us a little bit of a burst rate as well. So that means that we can press our shutter down and capture a few images at a time. Again, if we're shooting an event, we probably want to have both cards shooting to RAW. So that way, even if we have a card failure, we've got that full RAW resolution backup. We can actually also output a JPEG from a RAW file in camera that you can quickly and easily transfer off a little bit later on if you need to. But I digress. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole right now. Next, we've also got our image stabilizer settings. So I highly encourage everybody to, unless you're shooting on a tripod, please leave it on auto. I've seen lots of people out there saying, no, I get better results with the all direction shake, etc., etc. Look, OM-1 stabilizer is so good and so intuitive. Leave it on automatic, and the main reason for that is that it will not only compensate in all directions, so it'll still move in its 5 axes. But what happens when you leave it in automatic is that if you're panning left or right or vertically or whatever you happen to be doing, the camera will actually help you compensate for that movement if it's in auto. Whereas if you put it on an all direction, it's only going to do all direction shake. It's not going to compensate if you're panning. So please keep that in mind as well. But we definitely want to make sure that we have our stabilizer on, especially if we need to drop our shutter speed down. We're also going to leave our ISO starting point at 200, which means that we're going to get the absolute best image that we can. For those of you who are new to the camera, ISO 200 is your absolute sweet spot with the OM-1. Really only start to push your ISO away from 200 if your shutter speed's not right. So, and again, that's something that we can do on the fly. But when we're shooting in aperture priority, the camera is actually going to do that for us as well. Okay. So now that we've got all of those things set up the way that we need to, what we're actually going to do is press the menu button on the back of the camera. And what we're going to do is go to shooting menu 1 or camera 1 at the top of the screen. And then we've got custom modes. Okay, so press OK on custom mode. And now we've got 4 different options that we can have. So I'm going to save that to set. So assign, because all those things that I just made up, we're going to assign to there. Okay. Now, to show you how this actually works, what I'm going to do is go back to, well, I'm going to turn face detection off. I'm going to go back to shooting a single frame, and I'm going to go to single autofocus. Okay. So now I'm just in normal aperture priority on the top of the mode dial. Now what I'm going to do is go roll that around to C1, and bang, you can see all of those settings that we just saved are now our defaults. Okay. So it's really quick and really easy to set up those custom modes. But the reason why I highlighted that it was really important to get all of the things that you want for your everyday shooting as well as in your custom profile sorted before you start creating those custom profiles is that these will all be saved individually if anything changes in the back end or on our super control panel menu as you go. So that's really, really important to remember because we do get inquiries on that every now and again where they've manipulated something only for their custom profile or only for their regular shooting and then changed it to their custom profile. Everything, the way the camera was set up is now saved in that profile for C1. Okay. So that is a basic setup for what we would do for portraiture or shooting an event. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up something for birds in flight. Now, I know lots of people ask about this all of the time. It is definitely something that we, again, is an extremely challenging thing to do. And that's why I'm actually going to either use shutter priority or manual. I prefer manual personally, mainly because as long as I don't have auto ISO on, I can actually see the exposure change in real time as I make a change to it. But for birds in flight in particular, and also any sort of sports and wildlife, using auto ISO is actually a great thing to do, and especially on the OM-1 because its ISO window is so much bigger and so much more flexible than what we've had from previous models. So if we are going to do a birds in flight mode, guys, what I'm going to do is first thing I'm going to do is change my ISO to auto. The next thing I'm going to do is actually push my shutter speed. So I want to lock my shutter speed into something relatively quick. So I'm going to start at 1,000. Next, I'm going to go to my aperture, and I can either leave it wide open. Look, Olympus lenses are absolutely beautifully sharp at wide open. It also means that we can increase our shutter speed potential if we are shooting it wide open. But some people might want to say, oh, I want a little bit more depth of field in my shot or less, whatever it happens to be. Whatever it happens to be, guys, there's no right or wrong. I'm personally liking using my aperture at its widest opening, so I'm going to leave that at 2.8. Next thing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to continuous focus with tracking. I'm going to change, and the next thing I'm going to do is change my focusing points to all. Okay. Press OK. Now that's saved. And the final thing I'm going to do is the way that I set up my function button before. I'm going to press it and hold, or press it or tap that once, and I'm going to enable my bird subject photography. Okay. So quick look at all of the things that we've just done. I haven't changed our frame rate yet. So I'm probably going to push that up to, let's go whole hog. Let's go 50 frames a second to SH2. Press OK and save that. So now you can see all of those different settings in there. One thing you will have noticed is that when we use SH2, our ISO is limited to 12,800. The reason for that is to guarantee the quality and speed of the shot. It drops the ISO down to 12,800. Okay, so just in case you're wondering, why can't I push my ISO higher if I'm using SH2? That is why. If you do, for whatever reason, get into a low light situation where you actually need your full range, all you need to do is pop that back down to high-speed sequential with silent shooting. That's still going to get you 20 frames a second. So again, for most people, that's plenty. For the football that I shot over the weekend, my colleague Brett warned me that don't use 50 frames a second. Use either 10 or 20 or maybe even 15 because you can't fine-tune those. Because otherwise you're just going to come out with a lot of photos. And I didn't listen to him the way that I should have done, and I think I ended up with 3,800 images that I needed to go through on Sunday night. So tip for everybody, the fastest is not always the most appropriate. But when we're shooting birds, we actually do probably want to get as fast as humanly possible because, again, they're extremely fast moving and we want to make sure that we're getting the best result possible. Okay, so now that we've created that profile, what we're going to do is press that menu button again on the back of the camera, and we're going to go to C2, and we are going to set. So just to make sure that all of those things have been changed, what we're going to do is I'm going to go again back to sequential. We're going to go back to continuous focus. We're going to change our focusing point back to middle. We're going to disable our subject detection. And then from there, we're going to change our mode dial into C2. And bang, all of our settings are now changed. Okay, so a couple of questions that have just come through here. So question, in situations rapid panning on a monopod, would you still recommend auto ISO or vertical shake ISO? That's actually a really fantastic question because shooting motorsport where you are generally moving within a horizontal plane only, and you're using a monopod and that, or a tripod or a gimbal, whatever it happens to be, that's the important bit. If you are actually pivoting on one of those, then absolutely yes, I would recommend that you change it to vertical or horizontal, depending on the aspect of that you're using the camera. But if you're doing it 100% by hand, then leave it on automatic, and I still think you'll get the best results out of that. So really, really good question. Next, difference between high spot and low spot shadow exposure. really what you're talking about here is exposing for the highlights or exposing for the shadows. That's literally all that it's doing. So, and as you actually go into that exposure metering option, you'll actually see the way that the camera is manipulating the exposure, or where it's actually telling you the exposure should be. I should say, especially if you're shooting in manual. So that is, Andrew, that's literally all it's doing. From Laura, so how do you change your birds in flight settings for C2? That's the next part, Laura, and that is an absolutely fantastic question. So what people may or may not realize is so you can see that I'm in my custom profile here for C2. While I'm in that custom profile, I can sit in there and I can change my shutter speed. I can do whatever I need to do. What is going to happen though, as soon as I go out of that custom 2 C2 profile and go back into it, it's all going to go back to where I first set it up to. That's the whole point of that preset, is that it's just a starting point. But if you do want to actually go in and change all of those different things, what we can do is go into C2. So we're in C2 right now. For example, I'm going to pump my shutter speed up even higher. So I'm going to go to a 1600th of a second. Go to menu, go to custom mode, go to C2, save settings, set, bang. So now that I was on 1,000th of a second shutter speed, I'll go to manual, go back into C2. There we go. And now it's saved, or resaved, I should say, all of the settings that I had in there, but it's made that one change in there by setting. I know it gets a little confusing, and I think that might be why you're asking, is that you've got reset or set in there. We don't want to reset because that'll actually default it back to the way that the camera came straight out of the box. What we don't want to do is set based on the change that we've just made. So that's the quick and easy way to be able to do it. So from Andrew, so how do you add the histogram to your frame? That's a really quick and easy one, Andrew. So unless you've disabled this on your camera, all you need to do is press the info button on the back of your camera, and it's going to quickly change in between your different profiles. Now, you'll see in this view here, histogram is actually on the screen, but it's pushed right up against the left-hand side of the frame because obviously I've got my lens cap on. That's all you need to do, is just keep hitting that info button on the back of the camera, and it'll cycle between the different options. That also happens independently, actually, of when you're looking through the LCD screen or when you're looking through the viewfinder. So please keep that in mind. Okay, so that's our custom profile, folks. Before I actually move back into my presentation deck, because that is mainly the things. Oh, actually, no, I've forgotten something really, really important before we move on. Is how do we apply these custom profiles to function buttons? Because that is actually the fastest and easiest way to be able to go from our general shooting. So again, we're just shooting normally, capturing friends, family, whatever it happens to be, and then go, okay, I need to quickly transition into my birds in flight mode. So what I would do, and the fastest way to do this, and remember, I've already created the custom profile, so that's an important step. You need to do that first. What I'm going to do is press my OK button to get in my super control panel menu. I'm going to go to the little picture of the cog or the gear here for button function. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say change one of my front 2 buttons. I generally don't use my aperture preview, so I'm going to change that aperture preview to C2. So once I highlight that, guys, make sure you press the OK button to save it. Once it's saved, you'll see next to that button, it says C2. Tap my shutter button. So again, I'm just in my normal manual mode. I'm doing my thing. All I've got to do is press that button on the front of the camera, and bang, you'll see that it changes into C2, which is my birds in flight mode. So bang, I'm ready to shoot. I can still, as I mentioned before, I can still obviously change all of these things in my shutter speed, my aperture, my frame rate. I can still change all of that. You just got to remember that it'll, once you go out of this mode, it'll default back to whatever the way that that profile was saved. So as I said, guys, press that button once to enable it, press that same button once more, and then I'm back to regular shooting again. Okay, so the reason why that step is so important is that if you don't program those custom profiles to a button, it means that you've got to stop what you're doing, roll your mode dial on the top of the camera from wherever you happen to be to whichever profile you happen to be wanting to use. By applying it to a function button, super fast, super easy. to get in and out of there. But as we talked about earlier, really the only hard part of that is actually remembering which one of those profiles are. A really analog, but I think actually a really good tip that I got from a lady at a workshop, this was years ago, was what she did was on the inside of where the LCD folds down on the back of the camera, she actually wrote herself a little note and then stuck it in there for C1 is Astro, C2 is landscape, or whatever it happens to be. So really quick and easy way to remember what those are. But again, very analog. So, and obviously you've got to keep changing that if you do actually make any changes to those, if you actually want or need to use more than one or more than four custom profiles. So fingers crossed we do actually get that update where we can rename each of those custom profiles, because again, I think that'll be really beneficial. Okay, so just quickly before I get out of camera and go back to my presentation slides, guys, and thank you again, Brett, because you've been answering questions as we go along. But just quickly before I do go back to my presentation deck for our tips and tricks, is there any other questions that you want answered on your camera? Actually, you know what? Don't even stress, folks. I can cut back to my camera at any stage. That's really not going to be a problem. So what I'm just going to quickly do is change my camera back. There we go, back there. And now I'm back to presentation deck. There we go. So again, I know we've covered lots so far, folks, but we do have lots of time for Q&A. My time is yours, although I'm respectful of all of your time as well. I just looked at the time and realized how long we've been going for. So, so I'll quickly get into the tips and tricks, and then hopefully we can get into question time. So a couple of things that I do want to quickly mention is My Menu. Now, this is something that we've had for a couple of generations of camera, but My Menu is brilliant for being able to call out little settings or little options that you don't necessarily want to build into a custom profile, but it is something that you do change a lot. So instead of having to go menu button, find the tab, find the icon, and blah, blah, blah. What the quick and easy way to do this is to put things into My Menu is literally press the menu button on the back of the camera, use your arrow keys to highlight whichever option that you want, and then press the red button on the top of the camera. It'll ask you which tab you want to save it into, because you've got different tabs that you can actually save all of these things into. One thing that I found useful for this is that you actually use these based on the genre that you're shooting in as well. So my set one might be for my Astro stuff, or for my macro shooting, whatever it happens to be. So you can sort of group those things in together. But that is literally how simple and easy it is to put those into each of those tabs. So highlight what you want, press the red button on the top of the camera, and then it'll ask you which one of those 5 My Set menu options that you want to put that setting into. So what you'll also notice is that it does actually come up with a little note on the option that you've selected, that it is in My Menu, and also you've got My Menu 1, 2, 3, and 4. Or 5 actually, for each of those different options. Now, live neutral density filter. So for the landscape shooters in the room, especially those that are new to the camera and you haven't used Live ND before, Live ND is amazing. This is pioneered technology. So this is something that we're still currently the only brand that can do this in camera the way that we do it. And for those of you who haven't even heard that expression before, ND or Live ND, what a neutral density filter, a physical filter, would traditionally do is that you would put it on the front of your lens, or you'd have a cowl and you'd have those big drop-in filters go in the front of your lens. It's basically sunglasses for your camera. And what that is going to do is darken the initial exposure, which means that you can shoot for longer. So when you think about those beautiful shots of, moving water in particular is probably the biggest one. So rivers, waterfalls, that sort of thing, where all the water or the sensation of movement that it creates in the shot is beautiful and creamy and smooth. That's where you traditionally have to use a big physical filter that you put on front of your lens in order to shoot for longer. What Live ND gives you is the ability to do this in camera, but that's actually really only part of it, because you can quickly and easily, and as this is something that I've always perpetually got applied to a function button, is to not only enable it, so I'll press my AEL button on the back of the camera to switch it on, but then if I press and hold that button and roll my front control wheel, what it's actually going to do is change in between each of the levels of filter in there, because it's not just an on and off. You can actually control how strong or how long that filter actually is going to run for, or how heavily it's going to be applied to the shot. So with the OM-1, it's the best in class right now, and best from our brand, where it's got 6 stops that you can control in camera. But that's really only part of it. The other part of it is the live part. And the live part means that you can actually see what that exposure is going to look like before you capture. Okay. So again, if you wanted to put something on the 6 stop or the ND64 setting, you'll actually see through your viewfinder or through your LCD screen, you actually see what that sensation of movement or whatever it happens to be is going to look like in your frame before you capture. So really, really clever, really, really easy to operate. As I said, apply it to a function button. It works absolutely brilliantly. And there's no need to attach a physical filter to the lens, so that you're not weighed down, especially if you're getting into a challenging environment. And there's obviously no extra cost. And you actually get a better photograph because of it as well, because it's actually layering exposures on top of each other in order to control the overall ambient light. You're actually going to get a better raw file out of it. So it's broader dynamic range, or more detail in your shadows and highlights. So there's actually multiple benefits for using this in this particular fashion. Now, as I said, the fastest and easiest way to operate this is to use a function button. So press and hold that AEL button, or what I use for AEL button, on the back of the camera, and then roll between the filters, or it's just a press on, press off. But if you go into the back end menu, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see Live ND off. Quick note as well that I should mention is that Live ND will only operate for you. So for something you might look at it and go, why is mine grayed out? Live ND is only operational in shutter priority or in manual. Okay, and the reason for that is that the camera needs you, the photographer, to manually control the shutter speed in order to create the effect in combination with the filter. So just keep that in mind in case you were wondering, why has my camera got this grayed out? It's because you're in PA or program or aperture, I should say. But once we actually get into here, you can see the level of filter. But again, you don't want to control the level of filter here. You want to do it in real time with a function button, like I mentioned. But you can also enable or disable the live view simulation as well. I don't really understand why you would switch it off, because you want to see what that's going to look like prior to capture. But you have the option to do that if you really want to. Okay. So simulation, as I said, you can switch on or off, but highly recommend that you leave it on. Now, next, especially when we're shooting landscape, is high resolution mode. So one of the best things about this, especially with the OM-1, is the process is less than half the speed that it took to combine all of those images than it did with the EM1X and also the EM1. But it gives you a 50 megapixel RAW file when you shoot by hand, or it'll give you 80 megapixel RAW file if you shoot in tripod mode. But because by default it is applied to that red button on the top of the camera, you've just got to press it once. High-res mode is enabled, and it'll actually show you on screen when you press your OK button whether you're using. Actually, I should say, when you press and hold the red button and roll the rear control wheel, like what we talked about with Live ND, it'll actually show you which setting it's on, whether it's by hand or whether it's on tripod. Now, you definitely can't use, unless you've got like a really crazy shutter speed, you really can't use tripod mode by hand, because the stabilizer is completely disabled and there's a physical movement going on inside the camera that you're just not going to get the result that you need, because it actually operates differently when it's on tripod versus when you're shooting by hand. So I guess the coup with this, because we've been doing this for a while as a brand, the coup is actually being able to do it by hand, so you're not tied to a tripod. So again, getting to challenging environments, or getting in a scenario where you need that extra resolution, you can still do it by hand, and that's why high-res shot is so important. Okay, Paul, just a quick question from Paul Crisp. Is there a way to set Live ND in high-res mode to do a single shot and then revert to regular shooting? Unfortunately not, Paul. It is actually something that I've, in combination with something else, which I won't mention, because otherwise it's going to create a storm saying, oh, yes, we really want that. But it's actually one of the things that I know that I'm not the only one that's been asking for. Not so much a high-res shot per se, as in, well, let me take a step back. The reason why this can't happen with ND and high-res at the same time is because they're two different things that are happening at exactly the same time. When you shoot in Live ND, say for example, we're using our 6-stop filter, so the ND64. What it's actually doing in order to create that effect is breaking down whatever exposure time we set into smaller increments. So you've got the sensor being read out and then breaking that down into 6 smaller increments. But then when you've got handheld high res in particular, it's actually taking 12 individual shots using your handshake or any vibration in the camera to move that shot around, and then captures all that information and then put it all together. Right now, I don't believe that there is there is a way for those two systems to work at exactly the same time. You never say never, because our engineers are very, very clever people. But I thought I'd highlight that to you. The reason why it's very difficult to do is because you've got those two different systems operating, or to operate those two different systems at the same time would be a very, very big challenge. Okay, so thank you, Paul. Yes, Louise, I have not forgotten about your settings for shooting asteroids. So yes, bear with me on that. So quick couple final points, Louise. I'll come back to that for question time if that's okay. I just want to quickly rip through these last couple of points. The other benefit of shooting high res shot is they actually increase the dynamic range. So again, similar to like what we would have with live ND shooting. But you also get better noise performance from it as well, because and also better color representation, I should say. Activate and deactivate, again, this is by default. If you've changed that function button to do something different, then obviously it's not going to be the same, but that's what I was talking about with changing it from one to the other. Okay, you can also change this in the back-end menu, and you really probably only do this if you're shooting on a tripod in a studio. And the reason why I mention that is that you can set a waiting time, and you can also set a charge time. Now, the waiting time you can still use by hand if you really want to, but the charge time is probably more for when you're shooting in studio and you're shooting with strobes or flashes and that sort of thing. The reason why you would set a charge time is that if you've got multiple flash units or multiple strobes that are at absolute maximum highest output, it'll actually take a little bit of a moment for that recharge to happen before the next pulse will actually go. Because when you shoot on tripod mode, it'll actually pixel shift the sensor inside the camera 8 times in an actual physical pattern or a static pattern. But once each of those exposures is captured, that's when it combines all the images together. Now, if you're using, again, strobes that take a moment to recharge or flashes that take a moment to recharge, it'll actually delay each of those individual shots in between each movement, so the flashes have got enough time to be able to recharge. Okay, so in case you were wondering what that charge time is all about, that's what it's all about. And waiting time as well. Obviously, waiting time can also be very beneficial for you, because it means that you can focus, start taking the exposure, or hit the shutter button to start taking the exposure, wait a couple of seconds, and it means that you're having no contact with the camera whatsoever while it's about to take that high resolution shot, because obviously we don't want camera shake by pressing the shutter button to damage what we're trying to do. Live composite. Now, this is not so much what I would recommend, Louise. I know some people swear by live composite for absolutely everything night related, but not necessarily. And the reason why I say not necessarily is that live composite is great for light that is moving, whether it be fast or slow. Whereas for what you're looking to do with asteroids and that sort of thing, what I would probably recommend more would be either live time or just regular bulb shooting, because you can still set your camera up the way that you want to. And again, we'll cover that in a second. But just in case you've seen some stuff on live composite and go, oh, that'd work really, really well. Yes, it would for once the light comes into the frame, but really difficult to gauge what that sort of starting point is going to be, because obviously the asteroids are only going to come in and out of the frame. And also with live composite, once if it is really overexposed, or you've made that initial exposure really, really bright, it might end up just creating absolute streaks on across your frame, like kind of look like star trails, as opposed to here are asteroids as an individual shot once they're actually within the sky. So again, don't let me forget, I will come back to that. So light composite, as I said, great for capturing moving light, whether it be star trails or light painting. You do also have lots of live composite settings that you can go into. Once you're actually in live composite, guys, and you access this on the mode dial, so you go mode dial into B for bulb, roll the rear control wheel across to the left, and you'll see live composite come up in the bottom of your screen. Once you're there and you're ready to shoot live comp, press the menu button on the back of the camera, and it'll actually take you straight to these options. Otherwise, you can go into press the menu button, go to your composite settings, go to live comp, and all this stuff's going to come up. But the faster and easier way to change it, especially while you're in it, is to use that mode dial methodology. Okay. Bulb settings, yep. So that's time for shooting and that sort of thing. The guys actually this morning did something on light painting. So for those of you who joined that, I don't want to tread on their toes. I'm sure they went into a lot of detail on that. But if you are interested in more on live composite and live time and long exposure shooting, let us know in the comments. We'd love to meet your expectations and give you the things that we need. Okay, quick thing on birds and wildlife with Pro Capture. So I haven't really talked about Pro Capture all that much. And the reason for that is that I wanted to show you these slides so I can actually show you in real time what this actually looks like and what it's actually doing for you. Because if you do shoot sports, wildlife, events, anything where you're anticipating the action and you don't want to miss the shot, this is why Pro Capture is your best friend. And on the OM-1, it is the most advanced that it has ever been. So if you haven't used this before, folks, or if you haven't even heard of this before, the way that Pro Capture works is that once you enable it, and you can do it in focus lock at 120 frames a second, or you can do it with continuous focus with 50 frames per second. What you can actually do is, the way that you start the process is to half press your shutter button, and you'll see a little indicator come up on the screen to say that the process has started. It's not actually capturing images yet, but it kind of is. And the reason why I say it like that is that once you start the process, it's actually buffering the images that it sees through the sensor over and over and over again until you completely press the shutter button, and then bang, all of those images that were in the buffer get captured, and then you'll keep shooting afterwards as well. Okay, so the reason why this is such a powerful tool is that 9 times out of 10, because modern cameras are very fast to react from when we hit the shutter button to when it starts capturing, you're talking nanos of seconds. So the reason why this technology is so important is that when we missed the shot, it was actually us. It was actually us, the photographer, that missed it because we just didn't get our timing right. This is where Pro Capture comes in. And with the OM-1, you can actually pre-capture up to 70 frames, but still in raw resolution. And there's no other camera in the world that can do raw resolution with this. So there's been another one that's been released fairly recently that they made a big song and dance about. Well, welcome to 7 or 8 years ago when we first introduced it, but we're still the only brand that can do it in RAW. And that's a really important part of the process as well, is that you want to have the absolute maximum best file to be able to manipulate after the fact as well. Okay, so let me quickly show you in real time what it actually looks like. So here we've got our subject through our camera in our environment. So we half press our shutter button to actually start this process, and then we've got all of our images buffering in there. So again, we can take up to 70 if we really wanted to. And then we see the subject or we see the movement, and bang, we completely press our shutter button and we keep shooting afterwards. But what we'll actually find is that if we actually go back through all of the images in there, the one that we actually want is in those pre-captured frames. So before we actually even completely press the shutter button. Okay. So that is the power of Pro Capture. And again, still being able to do it at that speed. So 120 frames of focus lock or 50 frames continuous focus. Use it in combination with subject detection autofocus and still do it in RAW. That is an amazing piece of technology. So again, you access this in your drive modes, guys. So press the OK button, go to single shot, burst frame, and that sort of thing. Go across to the right, and you'll see Pro Capture in there. You got Pro Capture 1 and Pro Capture 2, or SH1 and SH2 Pro Capture, I should say. That's the difference between the two of them. SH1 will be the faster frame rate but no focusing, and the second one will be lower frame rate but with continuous focusing if you need it to. Okay, so please experiment with this, especially if this is the sort of photography that you do. It is amazing. You will get brilliant results out of it that no other camera in the world can is able to be able to capture in this way. Quick question here from Paul. So what happens if you fully press the shutter before Pro Capture is fully buffered? So when you say fully buffered, Paul, I suppose the way that you start that process is that is immediately at whatever shutter speed that you're shooting at as well. And that's something that I need to point out too, because if you're shooting at a 15th of a second versus a 1,000th of a second, obviously the amount of frames that you can capture is going to be a lot different, because at a 15th of a second, obviously that's very slow by comparison to a 1,000th or higher. So the amount of frames that you've pre-captured is obviously dictated a little bit by your shutter speed. in the time frame before, well, when you half press the button to when you actually fully press the button as well. So that is a consideration, but most of the time you are going to be using this at a reasonably good shutter speed. So they are going to be right up there. But even if the amount of images that you preset, so let's say we went the whole hog, we went the full 70. Even if the full 70 haven't been pre-captured in the buffer, whatever is in that buffer is still going to be locked and loaded into the card, and then you'll keep shooting from there. But the only time that that's going to be different is if the shutter speed dictates that the amount of frames in the buffer before you've actually completely pressed the shutter button is going to be lesser than what you've selected. That's really the only time that that's going to happen. And if it has, then unfortunately there's nothing you can do about that, because you're obviously very good and still quick on the trigger based on the subject that you were shooting. So, but yeah, that's pretty much what's going to happen. Okay, so does Pro Capture work with back button focusing? Great question, Edward, because that was actually one of the things that I was going to mention now, is that right now, Pro Capture still only operates when you're using your shutter release. Now, this is not a new thing. This is all of our previous cameras that have had Pro Capture have still operated in this way. Sorry, I'll just read a comment as was halfway through that sentence. That is something that we're potentially working on. I know that lots of people have asked, well, I exclusively use back button focus, so why can't I use that if I'm using Pro Capture? That is a work in progress. There is operational reasons for it, but it is something that we know would be beneficial for people if we were able to do that. So if that changes, obviously we'll definitely let people know, because there'll be lots of people that'll be asking about it. Okay, so that is Pro Capture. As I mentioned before, you can actually go into your sequential shooting settings and actually go in and change all of these speeds. So one big tip that I will give you around Pro Capture in particular is that by default, so you'll see Pro Cap SH1, so that is the highest frame rate. That's at 120 frames a second, as you can see on this slide here. But you'll notice on the next line down, we've got pre-captured images at 28, but we've actually got a frame counter of 50. So that means that we've actually set a limit to the total amount of frames that we're going to capture. Now, that can be a help, but it also can be a hindrance, especially if what action we expected to happen within that space. And again, if you're shooting at a very high shutter speed, that's not going to last for a very long interval of time. One of the things that I recommend to people to do is actually remove that frame counter, unless you know that that's exactly the window that you need to be shooting in. So again, it's in a more controlled environment. So step one, go into SH1. You'll need to do this independently for both. So go to Pro Capture SH1, go down your frame count limiter and switch that off or to 0. Then select the amount of pre-captured images. So again, 70 is huge, but again, if you never want to miss the shot, then that's what you would set it to. But I think in personal experience, even 50 is like a lot. A lot of the time, you probably really only need 20 or 30, especially if you're really concentrating on what you're doing, because your reaction time to when the camera is actually going to start is, again, very, very small. But I honestly think unless there's like a super requirement for it, 20 to 30 is heaps, and probably more than what you need. But also remember, once you've got those pre-captured 30, if you keep your finger on the shutter release, the camera's going to keep shooting after that as well. So again, I'd say turn the frame count limiter off, just so you don't miss that shot or miss that part of that sequence, I suppose. Because if you do, it'll hit 50 and then the camera's just going to stop shooting. Okay, and obviously we don't want that to. We don't want to limit the amount of shots that you're actually going to capture, or limit the action that you're going to be able to capture. So from Bob, I've had Pro Capture shut the camera down because I held the shutter down for too long. Oh, that's interesting, Bob. Was it on an OM-1 that has that happen to? Because I've never actually seen it personally happen, because I've never held the shutter down for long enough for it to happen. But I know I've been told that people have held it down there for more than an hour in order to do it. But the camera shouldn't actually shut down. I think the camera should just stop. So come back to me on that, Bob. I'm interested to hear a little bit more detail around that, how that actually happened. From Stephen, is Pro Capture helpful for lightning captures? Yeah, yes and no, Stephen. Yes, I understand what your thinking is, as in you're watching a storm over the water. You know that it's coming. Yes, it could. The only, I suppose, potential negative with that is that the image is going to be captured at whatever shutter speed that you've predetermined. So in order to see anything within that sky, and obviously we know we're going to have a big bright flash of light happen, um, make a couple of guesstimates, I suppose, about whatever your starting point's going to be, and then once you actually see a crack of lightning hit, go back and have a look at the images and then see whether it was under or overexposed. Um, what you're probably better off doing would be to use Pro Capture or the intervalometer. Not Pro Capture, sorry, live composite, I should say. Because with live composite, once you get that initial exposure set, each bolt of lightning is going to be written to the sensor independently. But it also means that as each of those strikes happen, you're not going to have that light creep like what you normally would with an untimed long exposure, where as that light gets brighter, it's going to continue to get brighter until it overexposes or destroys your shot completely. But again, it's all dictated by whatever that initial exposure is and the way that you can actually set that. So that comes with a little bit of experience, and each situation is a little bit different. So you'll probably learn more as you actually go through those steps, but definitely give live composite a crack with that, because I really think that that'll be the best way for you to capture it, because you can literally just set the camera up, set it to a half a second refresh, set the camera, and go. And then each bolt of lightning is going to be captured as it comes along. Okay. So Bob, on an OM2. Oh, so on a film camera? so, sorry, Bob. I'm sure what you probably mean is an EM1 Mark II potentially. If that's the model that you're talking about. That was actually our first ever camera that had Pro Capture. Yeah, the Mark II is the camera that shut down after held for a while. Yeah, cool. Thank you, Bob. So yeah, the camera shouldn't completely shut down unless it runs out of battery. But and like I said, I've never seen it personally. I've only heard it anecdotally that somebody said they reckon that they held it there for about an hour, and then the camera just stopped pro capturing, and then obviously you just had to start all over again. But yeah, I'll be interested to see. I've never actually tried it with an OM-1 to see how long you could actually do that for, because this has got a lot more processing power in it as well. Okay, so that's setting up our Pro Capture, guys. Again, remember that you've got to turn that frame counter limit off, or otherwise it will hit the buffer or hit the maximum and then stop. My last little bit to everybody, guys, is updating your firmware. So again, I'm not gonna go through all of this in massive detail, but it is something that we constantly get questions about, predominantly with people that use Mac. Now, unfortunately, the extra security step that you need to do, and it is available on our website too, by the way. It's particularly for people that are using Macs with M1 or M2 chip. But there is potentially an extra security step that you need to do to allow developers, instead of block everything completely off. The actual program, the workspace program, will run, but as soon as it tries to externally connect to the firmware server, it'll just say no. It's not going to allow you to do that. So, but as long as everything is actually working the way that it should do, these are the steps that you're going to need to take. Now, I'm going to start with how to do it on your phone, so on a mobile device, I should say, because you can do it on pads as well. And then we'll talk about how to do it on PC or Mac as well. So first step for any firmware upgrade, doesn't matter which camera you're using, is make sure that your battery is 100% charged before you begin. Now, you can do this on your app, but you need to go through the initial pairing process first. So what you would need to do is, with your camera powered on, in the top left-hand corner, there's a little Wi-Fi Bluetooth icon. Tap on that, and it's going to come up with device connection. Press OK on device connection, and then a QR code is going to come up on the back of the camera. Once you open the app, so it's a free download, guys. This costs you absolutely nothing. When you first open the app, this is the screen that you're going to see. At the very bottom of that screen, you tap on it, and it's going to say Easy Setup. Then all you need to do is follow the prompts that come up on the app. So it'll say scan, hit camera, and it'll come up with your camera activates on your mobile device. Hold that over the back of the camera, and then click OK a couple of times while it goes through Bluetooth and Wi-Fi pairing. Now, once that's all happened and your camera is connected, you'll actually see some of those icons at the bottom of the screenshot that I've got there go blue. What you're going to need to do from there is go into the top right-hand corner, go to the picture of the cog or the gear, And then this is the next screen that you're going to see. You're going to see camera management. Now, this is only for applicable cameras, folks. So it is for the OM-1 and the EM-1 Mark III. They're the only two cameras in our range that can do this. So just as an FYI. Once you go to camera management, then you can go to update firmware. So click on update firmware, and it'll say check for update. Now, note, and this is important because it's really cool, is that any lens that you have attached to the body, it's going to check the lens and update the lens if you need it to be done as well. So the whole point behind this was to give people a completely wireless solution. So you could do all of this stuff wherever you happen to be instead of having to be tied or tethered to a computer. So check for update, and if there is an update available, so you can see on that screenshot, because when these were done, one didn't have any firmware updates. You go click update, and then once it goes through that process, it's going to say update complete. Now, I've used this a couple of times for EM-1 Mark III and also for my OM-1. One thing that I did notice happen once was that, because it will load all of your settings off your camera first, what I found is that it didn't automatically put all of my settings back on. That previous screen sort of stayed on there. But all I needed to do was turn the camera off, turn it back on again, pair it back up again with the app, and the app automatically recognized that it hadn't finished the process, and then it reloaded all of my settings. Okay, so if you do get in that position, don't fret. All you've got to do is reconnect, and everything's going to happen the way that it needs to again. Okay, cool. A couple of questions from here. So for Paul, love ProCap, let me get shots are never able to normally. Just takes a while to go through all the shots when you start editing. Paul, absolutely, and that's why I get the concept behind having that shot limiter in there. But I just wouldn't want to miss out on something that was a really cool part of that sequence, or because it sort of hit that frame maximum and then went, okay, no, I'm stopping now. So thank you, John. Thank you very much. Lost feed when you're talking about firmware updates on the number. Where can I get help? Not a problem at all, because again, we've got a little bit of time. I'm just going to quickly, just for I'm just going to quickly go back to the beginning of doing this on app. So again, guys, first step, make sure that your battery is fully charged. You need to go through the pairing process with your camera, as I mentioned before. So you've got to make sure that you pair up the app with your camera. But once you've done that and the app is connected to your camera, you go up into the top right-hand corner there to the little picture of the cog or the gear. Go to camera management, and then we go to update firmware. Next step is check for update. So it'll check the body and the lens that you have attached at the same time. And if there is an update, all you need to do is select update. It'll go through its steps, and then once it's done, it'll say update complete. And it will save your settings as well. If it hasn't automatically saved your settings when it's finished actually updating, and you actually have an OK that comes up on your screen, make sure you don't turn the camera off until you see that big OK come up on the back of the camera. Once it's gone through all of that, you can turn the camera off, turn it back on again, repair it with the app, and it will reload all of your settings and everything that's saved on there as well. Quick one while I'm reading. So, Kerry, thanks for mentioning so much to learn. Great to have this to go back to. Kerry, thank you very much for your kind words. Appreciate it. And yes, you can, again, you can go back and re-watch all of the stuff that we're doing here today. Latest update for OM-1. That's a good question. I think it's 1.5. Actually, I'll need to go back to my camera, but I'm pretty sure it's 1.5. And that was only a month or 6 weeks ago. So definitely keep your camera up to date. What is from Steve? What is the name of the app? It is called OM Image Share. So if you type into Google Play or to the App Store, just type in OM System or OM Image Share. It'll be the first thing that comes up. Use the app for a couple of firmware updates and lenses. Much easier than the computer. Yep, I totally agree, Paul. From Bob, yes, 1.5. Thank you very much. So, recognize one camera. Yes, from Mr. Rhodes or Mrs. Rhodes. Apologies, I've only got a first letter there. I had to forget the previous camera to repair. Yeah, that is correct. You can use the app to do things on multiple cameras, but you can only do it one at a time. That's actually a really good point. Now, just quickly, folks, before we get into Q&A, and again, I know we've gone for a really, really long time, so thank you all for bearing with me. But again, I had lots to cover today. Once you download the OM Workspace program, plug the camera in via the USB cable that came with it, turn it on, and then you'll see these options. Make sure you press OK where it says storage. Then once you've got the program open, you can go to the top of the page and go to update. Now, once you go to update, it's going to scan, again, the body as well as the lens that you've got connected on there as well. And if there is an update available, click update. It is going to save your settings and then put the settings back on afterwards. That's why these two tick boxes are so important. You've got to wait for the camera to come up with OK on the back of the screen. Tick both of those boxes. Once OK is on the screen, you need to turn the camera off, turn it back on again, click next, and then it will reload all of your settings on there as well. Okay. So really quick, really simple, and then obviously you can do multiple products at the same time. And you actually follow that same process of saving your settings when connecting to the camera as well. So instead of going to update, you go to save, and once you've saved them, if you want to reload them, you can go to load as well. So again, really quick and easy way to be able to save all of those settings, especially if you have multiple bodies or you've loaned out bodies and somebody's completely changed absolutely everything on the camera. You can quickly and easily reload all of those custom settings on there as well. So again, same process. And you can also do the same process like updating your firmware on your mobile device. You can save all of your settings in exactly the same format as well. So we go to a little tab in the top right-hand corner of the app, go to camera management, and then camera settings, and then we can save and load profiles that we've already created in there as well. So all the way up to 4. Okay. Whew. Okay. That was a lot, folks. I appreciate you bearing with me. Again, we've covered a lot of things. We've just clicked over 2 hours. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And I want to make sure that I've got all questions covered. Brett, I think you covered Luis's questions for shooting asteroids, I think. So thank you very much for that. Also, a note here, found that, yeah, no, we've done that. From Paul, also use the app for saving custom modes. Okay. You anticipate, well, we're on the same page there, Paul. Well done. Cool. All right. So, folks, again, I very much appreciate that we have covered a lot. And again, this is why we record these sessions, so you can go back and rewatch them. But obviously, we want to keep engaging with everybody as well. We want to keep talking to you. We want to keep hearing from you about the things that you want to see and hear from us. As a team, what is absolutely amazing about the setup that we've got now with OM-SYSTEM is that we've got a global platform to be able to talk to people, all places, all time zones, all walks of life, and all different cameras and lenses and genres. So thank you very much for joining me today, but please stay on the lookout for the other workshops that all of the global team have got happening for the whole lead up into World Photography Day, which is obviously this weekend. If there aren't any other questions, I will let everybody get back to doing what they were doing, especially for those of you who might be getting a little bit late in the evening. But if there's nothing else, guys, I will sign off, but I will quickly give you one last opportunity if we've got any other questions, because again, I want everybody to walk away having all of their questions answered. Seeing lots of thank yous come through as well. Thank you for joining. I just remembered there's a 60-second delay in between me asking a question to when you folks actually see it, and then I've still got to give you a moment to type. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to give that a little bit of a space while everybody can still ask any other questions that they do. From Paul, yes, might see you out shooting in Melbourne. Yeah, I'm actually doing a football game again this Sunday, so you might not see me in the city, but I'll definitely be shooting, and I hope all of you guys are as well. So lots of thank yous. Thank you very much, everybody. As fast as you've talked, I've actually kept up. I'm sorry, Bob. I know other people have said that I talk too quickly, and that is definitely something that I know that I need to be conscious of, because I just get excited, and I know there's lots that we need to get through, and then I start ramping up my either volume and or speed, or both at the same time. So thank you very much for bearing with me, everybody. And please, again, as soon as I'm not, maybe not immediately, but not long after I end this broadcast, this recording will be available to everybody. So if there's no other questions, folks, again, I'll sign off. Thank you again so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure, and looking forward to seeing you all again very, very soon. Otherwise, stay safe and have a fantastic World Photography Day. Cheers, folks.